This thing. All right. I had to, it changed the stream key on me again. I had to update. I don't know why. It's been consistent for weeks, and then all of a sudden it's gone. Yeah, a different one again. Who knows? Can you guys hear me okay if I talk loud? I don't need to set up a mic or... Okay, yeah, well, we'll cross that one thing at a time, Linda. One thing at a time. All right. Man, well, never mind. I was going to rant about technology for a little bit. We'll save that for another day. We will save that for another day.
Be over 70.
Yeah, I'm sure that's a much tougher thing to navigate. Okay, so never mind. I need to focus my ideas. First session of Native Peoples of the Pacific Northwest. So today is going to be a bit of an introduction. So here are the three stages three phases of this that we're going to look at. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to paint the picture of what the landscape looked like pre-white colonialization. Okay, so we're going to look at, to the best of our ability, and I'll explain a little bit of that later, to the best of our ability, what the Oregon and Washington looked like before European settlers came in. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit about practices. We'll talk about what the people ate, what they did. What was. I mean, this. We'll talk about this in a little bit, but this is a map just of the tribal affiliations of Oregon, right? So you remember, I'm for those of you that may have heard me rant about this before. The diversity of language and tribal affiliation in Oregon and Washington is significantly greater than you get, for example, in the Plains tribes and stuff like that, which is one of the difficulties of talking about a cohesive history of these folks. And we'll talk about some more reasons why that's difficult in a little bit. So we're going to talk about what their world looked like to the best that we can. Then the second phase is going to be talking about basically the history leading up through white settlement and the reservations. Okay, so in Oregon, all of the establishments of the reservations were done between 1851 and 1856 was the final piece there. So first European settlers that arrived at the coast, I should have my notes in front of me. We're talking late 17th century. You've got Spanish, British, and French that are moving into the area and establishing relationships with the existing tribes. And then through 1850, what you essentially witness is, genocide is technically the wrong word because the major mechanism of the decline of the tribes was disease. So you've got the introduction of smallpox and one of the diseases they refer to as cold sick, warm sick, which may have been tuberculosis, may have been something else. So what you witness is this is around dawn of the 17th century. By 1850, when the tribes are moved to reservations, we're talking a fraction of the population of the original tribal members. So we'll talk about kind of what the white settlement looked like, what the reservation process looked like. That's phase 2. And then phase 3 is we're going to be talking essentially the Termination Act through the Restoration Act to modern era. And I'll give you a little bit of information on this today. Today is an orientation module. We won't really get into the nitty gritty until the next week and the following weeks. But I want to be able to paint that picture for you so you understand what we're talking about. Does that make sense? And I want to, and remind me today, I want to give you some resources that I've been using, because believe it or not, there are lots of resources out there, especially post 1983 for specific reasons. The tribes that we're mainly going to focus on, once we kind of like dig into the details a little bit, are the tribes of the Grand Ronde Reservation. Okay, so, and that's because Grand Ronde is right here, essentially, and we're right here, okay? And so the Grand Ronde Reservation essentially took all these tribes right here. And we'll talk about that and what that means. Okay, so let's actually start with what you all know. So what tidbits or what pieces do you know about the native peoples of this area or just the Pacific Northwest in general, if anything? Susan.
Well, studies with X-rays of skulls showed that the tribes along the Columbia who had a high salmon diet had less decay than those inland ones who had more berries in their diet.
I love that you're able to bring the dental facet to this. That is awesome. So, examination of skulls and tooth decay has shown that tribes near sources of water primarily had a salmon diet and less tooth decay than those inland or in the plains, for example, like the Burns Paiute population down here. Yeah. What else? What else do people know about?
I just read the Lewis and Clark Journal, and they talk about the tribes that they come across.
Yeah.
In the 1800s.
Yes.
It's hugely different from, not just the Indians, but the animals, it's everything. It's incredibly different.
Yeah, so next week I'm gonna, if I can get it to work, I might have to bring in an extra laptop. I'm gonna show you a video. It's about 15 minutes that it has been put together by the Grand Ronde Educational Trust, or Grand Ronde, yes, Educational Trust, that kind of actually does a really good job of painting that picture, talking about what foods they ate, you know, where tribes lived, what the wildlife looked like. Yeah. What else? Paul and Andrea, I'm asking the question, what do you already know about the first peoples, the native peoples?
So they know there were three main pandemics that sort of ran up the Columbia River. There was one in the 1776 era, there was one in the 1820s, then there was another one in like 1867.
Yeah.
And each one of those really knocked back a lot of the people, and they just didn't even know what was going on.
Yes. And if,
That's a big impact.
yes, huge impact. And if you recall from when we put this timeline together, one of the things we talked about was that when the first Europeans arrived, they found an abundance of peoples. So for example, on Sauvie Island, there were actually two separate tribes that lived on Sauvie Island. One occupied the north shore, one occupied the south shore of Sauvie Island. So the way that the tribes differentiated themselves to a greater extent, especially the water habiting tribes, was where their fishing grounds were. So there were actually two bands of, I think one was, there was a band of the Multnomah and one was a band of the Scappoose that were on Sauvie Island that fished those waters there, which, you know, is kind of essentially the mouth of the, it's not the mouth of the Columbia quite, but it's, you know, where the salmon were coming down the Columbia River there, yeah. So yes, exactly that. What else? Any other pieces? Jim?
You know, when I worked for BP at Montreal Power in the Northwest annually, and we had a big impact on the waters of the tribes, and we worked with a lot of tribes putting power lines
Yeah.
through their land, whatever. Anyway, we'd meet with them once a year in management, and they would just half circle maybe 40 of the leaders, and they would go through. And what I remember often being said, they were very proud and they have a vision of the future. They would say, we've been here for thousands of years.
Yeah.
You folks are a blip in our,
Yeah.
and we see a vision
Yeah.
that we're going towards, and we're working that way. And it was like this powerful vision of
Yeah.
where they've been, where they are now, and where they're going.
And so I'll show you a link in a little bit. I want to talk about this map first. So the Grand Ronde Reservation, the Grand Ronde Confederated Tribes have put together, so during COVID, they put together a series of videos which were educational videos for their youth and youth and kids, because normally the Grand Ronde culture. So here's the thing I did not realize is actually the Grand Ronde Cultural Center of Portland is just down the road from me. It's on Barber Boulevard, just as you're heading into Southwest Portland. So they normally hold classes on the reservation itself for anybody with tribal affiliation, anybody that's a member or has lineage or heritage that they can trace back to one of the member tribes of the Grand Ronde Tribal Confederation. And they have cultural classes. They have classes that talk about the dances that are part of their history, that teach the language, so they teach Kilopaya. They teach about the nature. They teach about the different plants that grow in the Pacific Northwest. They talk about their uses, which ones you can make into tea, which ones are edible. So there's been a really big push to re-educate the native peoples of the Pacific Northwest and to reconnect them with their cultural heritage. And one of the fascinating things that I kind of gleaned from the videos, it's the way in which they talk about it, is they don't see their history as being ended. When we shuffled them all off into reservations, the land changed is one of the ways that they talk about it. And it's right at the introduction of this video that I'll show you next week, where they talk about this is what the land used to look like, and this is the way the land looks like today, and they show a picture of downtown Portland. And they kind of say, many of the things that we used to celebrate aren't here anymore, but there are many different things and many new things, right? So one of the common misconceptions about Native peoples in general, but especially Native peoples in the Pacific Northwest, is that they all live on reservations, which is actually, it's almost the polar opposite. In fact, the majority of Native peoples, especially that are part of the Grand Ronde Confederated Tribes, live in and around the Portland area, right? There is housing on tribal lands, but there isn't nearly enough land to support all the people that have tribal affiliation, because there's about 60,000 folks that can trace their lineage back to one of the Confederated tribes. So like I was saying, this is a map of Oregon, and probably the best way to understand it, and maybe you already picked it out, is you can tell that the tribal affiliations are geographical in nature, right? So here we've got the Cascades, one of the dividing lines. Here we've got the coastal ranges, right? And then you've got the rivers that come down here. And actually up here, if we could trace where Hood River is and where it traces down this way, what you'd see is that these names here actually could have been subdivided geographically by that. So what a lot of the tribes did that lived, especially along the Columbia River, is they had fishing grounds, and then they had the grounds they lived in when the fish weren't running, right? And so they'd spend part of the time of the year up along the river, and then they'd move down south a little bit to where their more permanent housing was. Like I said, the tribes that we're going to talk about primarily, or that we're really going to delve into, are the tribes, the Kalapuya, and the Kalapuyas refer specifically to the language that they spoke. So this is the other piece, is that all these different colors are actually the colors in the key are actually the linguistic commonalities, right? So the folks down here, the Paiute, spoke Uto-Aztecan. So it's actually a language strain that we can trace way down towards southwest of the United States, actually. These folks spoke Kaiute. These folks spoke Plateau Penutian. And then this is the Kalupayan, and actually there was a different name for it, which I'll tell you in a little bit, which was the name that they referred to it as. And then we've got the Penutian here, and then that Athabascan down here, and then Shushla over there. So the way in which we historically kind of track the origins of peoples, obviously, is by what language they spoke. Now, one of the realities of the process of moving folks onto a reservation was, for example, the Grand Ronde Reservation now has about 27 affiliated tribes. But if we were to go back to this day and age and look at the number of tribes that would have been covered by the territory that the Grand Ronde covers now, then this is a pure estimate based on, archaeological and historical research. Many scholars suggest that there probably would have been closer to 41 tribes that were covered by this area. And the reason that we have this different tribal delineation is because culture and language, right? And so even though these all, the folks in blue all spoke a version of the Kalapuyan, they had regional dialects, tribal dialects. And because especially the water-dwelling folks, they had their fishing lands, and they didn't really move off it much, right? Because if you've got the source of your well-being, you don't need to journey to different fields looking for other food. And they never had to worry about overfishing, shockingly, right? There was always enough fish. And when we begin to talk about some of the major conflicts that we experience as European settlers move in, that to this day remains one of the major conflicts is fishing rights, right?
I was just going to say, I think we, like most,
Yeah.
don't appreciate that. In our mind, we vanquished these people.
Several times.
Yes.
Several times, yeah.
And so
Yeah.
they've already been assimilated and they do not exist in our minds. But if you really want to vanquish them, then kill the salmon.
Yeah,
And they will be dead.
yeah,
Just as you killed the buffalo to the extent we did.
yep,
That was the true cost.
totally. Yeah, and actually, and I've got a couple of good stories that I could tell about that. So, up in Washington, there's a tribe that is in Puget Sound area, the Lummi, L-U-M-M-I, and they have had several battles with the Fish and Game Wildlife Administration over the course of history. And the reason being, and this has become legal precedent for pretty much any of the Pacific Northwest tribes, is that the fishing rights that were guaranteed to all of the tribes in the treaties that were made that brought them onto the reservation were that they had, and it wasn't explicitly in these words, but essentially it's interpreted as they have unlimited access to their hereditary fishing grounds. Okay, and that was defined differently, but the Lummi especially had a stretch along Puget Sound which had great clam and oyster and shellfish fishing, but also had salmon fishing and others in the waters that were there too. So two different conflicts that occurred over the course of their history were that, I may have already told this story, but I find it's hilarious. The U.S., because we're such amazing folks, it was specifically the members of the Fish and Wildlife Department of Washington, as well as several private interests, namely commercial fishermen who wanted access to these waters, essentially conspired to take their fishing grounds from them. And what they really wanted access to is they really wanted access to the tidal areas that the Lummi had control over for different reasons. But what happened is the Lummi were pretty wise to what was going on. And despite several different attempts to there were claims that were placed on the shoreline by different private landowners. There were attempts to restrict the Lummi from going out and fishing. They managed to, for the most part, dodge those. So finally, what happened was there was a conspiracy amongst several parties. I mean, and these aren't individuals; these are governmental organizations, right, that are trying to circumvent what is literally constitutionally guaranteed tribal agreements that we, the United States of America, have made with these sovereign peoples. So what they finally did was there were some Austrian fishermen that wanted to fish the area, and so several Fish and Wildlife wardens said, go fish these waters, because they kind of wanted to test the waters, so to speak. Keep in mind, this was like 1912 or something like that, so just leading up to World War I, so tensions were high. You've got, again, Austrians. It wasn't an actual governmental Austrian boat, it was just Austrians who were flying the Austrian flag, came into Lummi waters. And so what the Lummi did, because they were encroaching their waters, is they went out and arrested them and brought them back onto their tribal property and put them in prison, essentially. And they sent a message to Fish and Wildlife Administration, to the state government of Washington, and said, we have captured some people who were violating Lumi water grounds, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're just letting you know. We're going to hold them prisoner, essentially. And so that, of course, created a panic, and within very little time, they had mobilized the federal forces and everybody to try and negotiate the release of these Austrians. And to make we'll talk about this in a little bit of detail when we get to that point, but to make a very long story short, what ends up happening is they release the Austrians, but in exchange, the government agrees to acknowledge that the Lumi waters, the Lumi coastal waters, include whatever the tide uncovers, right? So they actually control the waters all the way out to low tide, which is still the precedent in the state of Washington today. In California and Oregon, it's the opposite. When the tide comes up, you own wherever the tide is at, right? So if you're a beachfront property owner, you know, if the tide is high tide, you got up to the water, and you know the rest is public waters. In Washington, it's the opposite. It's out to low tide, you know, is where your property lies. So that's one story.
As far as the salmon, kind of interesting thing to watch. I've been watching the future there. Salmon depend on water, right? And with the drought and everything,
Yes.
there's already plans done to get the water from the Columbia down to the southwest.
Yes.
Those plans are in the file.
Yeah.
But then the salmon were put on the endangered list.
Yeah.
And that kind of stopped that, to take the water, pipe it down to Lake Shasta, which is about high, and then down to the southwest in Arizona and California. So watching this Endangered Species Act with the drought,
Yeah.
with these interim drawings already in place to basically dry up the Columbia and send it down southwest, it is a true political struggle.
And so a lot of the conflict, I don't know if you guys have been seeing this in the news or not, but a lot of the conflict that's happening down in Southeast Oregon right now is because they didn't open the reservoirs this year. Specifically because water levels are so low that if they would have opened the reservoir, it would have brought the water levels to a point it would have killed the salmon in the river. So the reason that they have to do that is because of treaty agreements with the native peoples down there. And it has to do with this long history of legal battles over exactly what fishing rights entail. And the argument is that if there are no fish to fish, the treaties or the tribes no longer have fishing rights. The Lumies ran into an exact same situation where in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, they actually developed their coastal property into an aquaculture. So they created this big break wall. They essentially created this entire industry of oyster and clam farming there, as well as creating some spawning ponds for salmon and all kinds of stuff. What has happened within just the last 10 years due to global warming and due to some other stuff is that there has been fertilizer runoff from local farmers that have run into their spawning ponds and have killed off all the fish. And so now there is an active lawsuit by the Lumi against the Washington Department of Agriculture, you know, basically saying if we don't have any fish to fish, we don't have fishing rights anymore. So saying you need to do something about these farms that are, you know, creating runoff into our thing. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating, and it's been a very high tension thing over, you know, especially in recent history. Michigan, you know, for me, there's a long history of fishing rights battles there between native tribes and between commercial fishermen. In fact, one of my neighbors growing up was a commercial fisherman who kept having to move his fishing grounds because of different legal battles about fishing rights. So, yeah, and we'll talk about the context of that as well too. Okay, I want to show you another map here. So that's the way things looked in 17th century, 18th century. Where did my other one go here? Sorry, you're seeing the live stream now. Oh, wrong one. There we go. So this is the way things look like now. Okay, so these are the federally recognized tribes and the different reservations that they control. All y'all probably recognize the biggest one here, which is the Warm Springs Reservation. So just as you cross over the 26 and onto 35 and drop down towards the Bend Redmond area, you are passing through the largest stretch of reservation land in Oregon, which is the Warm Springs tribe. And the Warm Springs Confederation of Tribes includes the Tenino, Wasco, and Northern Paiute, which is roughly this whole thing. Now, one of the things that's interesting about that is, unlike the Grand Ronde Confederation, which was people that were generally similar language speaking, generally kind of similarly cultural, the Warm Springs Reservation includes a bunch of diverse peoples. So when the Warm Springs was initially created, that was one of the conflicts that occurred within the reservation itself, was that there were three major languages that were being spoken, and kind of through a linguistic competition, or a linguistic survival of the fittest, Wasco ended up being the primarily spoken language there. And this is one of the things that the tribes are struggling with today, is like, for example, when you've got 41 tribes that historically, would have been represented in this reservation, they're trying to go back and revive some of these old languages. But of course, there are no written records, or very few written records. And considering the loss of population that occurred, there just isn't really enough of an oral history to really get back to a lot of the original dialects and original spoken languages. One of the books that I read, which is When the River Ran Wild, which is an account by a guy who was raised in the Warm Springs Reservation, is really great at talking about that. And he talks about when he was little, he spoke two of the different languages that were spoken on the Warm Springs. But then, of course, he had to learn to speak English eventually. There were English schools on the reservation, which that's another piece we'll talk about eventually. And by the time he learned English, he had essentially forgotten, he wasn't speaking them anymore. His grandmother was the one who raised him. His grandmother was the one who she spoke primarily Wasco, but she spoke some Sahaptin as well too. But he by the time he was a teenager or a young adult, he'd lost that. And then it was kind of over the course of his life that he ended up regaining an interest in his roots, his ancestry, and ended up going back and learning to speak Wasco again, and doing things like that, which fascinating story. So we already pointed out there's Warm Springs. Here's the Fort McDermott. This is a lesser known one. It borders over onto Nevada, Idaho. Burns Paiute Reservation, it's the Burns Paiute tribe specifically, had some notoriety a few years back when you had the Ammon Bundy occupation. So that was this was one of the really fascinating things. It was bordering on the Paiute Reservation, which creates this really interesting legal issue of reservation land is land that's held in trust by the U.S. government for these tribes. And so technically it's a really complicated legal thing that we'll talk about later, but it's sovereign land to a certain extent. And so you've got federal land that's being occupied by Ammon Bundy and his folks right next to reservation land. So when I was talking to the guy that's pastor of the ELCA church down there, he was talking about how traumatizing it was for members of the Burns Paiute tribe to know that there was this conflict going on, on their back door, essentially. Umatilla Reservation up here. So that is, Nez Perce was primarily in Idaho and east of there, but that's Nez Perce, Cayuse, Walla Walla, from which that area takes its name. Palouse, which Palouse is another region that we know. Nez Perce I already mentioned. Klamath tribes don't have a reservation, but they do have a tribal center essentially down near Klamath Falls. And even there, it's, you've got Northern Paiute, Klamath, Modoc, Yahuskin, sorry. And then Grand Ronde is up here. Siletz Reservation, you guys probably have driven through at one point or another going to the coast. And then the Coos Bay Reservation down here, which you've also probably driven through if you've ever traveled up and down the coast there. So that's the Coquille and Coos Bay tribe. And then finally there's the Cow Creek Reservation, which is the Umpqua tribe.
On that one on the coast that you were talking about, where's Florence compared to that,
Somewhere near there. So I remember it viscerally because Elena and I did a trip down here a while back, and we actually stopped on the reservation for one reason or another. I can't remember what we were doing. We stopped there to get lunch or something like that, and it was only like, oh, we're on reservation land, because there was the tribal Grand Lodge and all that jazz. But I can picture it in my brain.
So you don't know if it's closer to Florence or Newport?
I can look it up on Google Maps and tell you. But all these show up on Google Maps, right? So you can actually see the reservation boundaries if you want to go and explore this on your own. And next week or the week after, we'll look at Washington too. I mean, we don't live in Washington, but I still find it interesting because it's almost a completely different, similar culture, different languages, but the way that their history's played out is different, right? Two different territories. But,
I have a friend who has Indian blood, and he grew up thinking he was with a certain tribe that came out of Washington, until he researched it back far enough to find out that his great-great-grandmother was kidnapped from a tribe in Canada and brought down. So his affiliation really goes into Canada.
So this is something, this is the complexity of talking about history as well too, is that slavery was a practice of many of the tribes, especially the Taino and the Burn and the Paiute. They would capture each other back and forth. Keep in mind, it is not that slavery in any form is good. It's a distinctly different form of slavery from what the United States of America practiced in bringing the Africans over and all that jazz. It was kind of more like prisoner of war essentially, but you had to work was a big part of it. But there was movement of peoples significantly, and when we look at Washington as well, you'll see that the eastern side of Washington was essentially one consistent, body of people, and so you had people that were being moved even from down here. You had Nez Perce that were being moved up through. So yeah, hearing that story is not a shocker. One of the things that's true today. So I talked that there are over 60,000 Native peoples that live in and around the Portland area. Almost every one of them trace their lineage now to multiple tribes, right? None of them have a straight line back to a tribe. There weren't a whole lot of folks that survived, and we talk about the Oregon Trail of Tears, which is when they were moved from Table Rock all the way up to what is now the Grand Ronde Reservation over a period of several months. And of course, they could have done this at any time, but they did it in February while the snow was high. It's a lot of the documents that I end up reading they're just historical documents, right? They're notes that were taken by people. And so, the one piece that really just was kind of soul killing was the guy that was in charge of moving the tribes onto the Grand Ronde Reservation. Started with around 300 folks at Table Rock, and when he arrived at Grand Ronde, he had 300 people, and so he celebrated the fact that he arrived with as many Indians as he started with, except that there were people that died and people that were born during that journey, and so it was a net zero, and he was celebrating that fact, right? But he had many infants that were born during the journey, and many people that died due to weather attrition, and actually there were bandits that were attacking the caravan of the tribes as they were going forward, out of spite, out of who knows what. Jim, sorry.
It's kind of interesting. Down Ashland, also the arts, music, art.
Yeah.
Where they'll, at the beginning, they will say, now, be aware, we are on this tribal land.
Yeah.
And we honor them. And the arts seem to be taking on this responsibility to let people know that these nations existed or do exist.
Yeah, so what you're talking about specifically is a rather modern movement in talking about land acknowledgement, which is something that actually the Oregon Synod partakes in as well now. Two is celebrating is the wrong word, but naming the fact that the land that we live on, the land that our churches are built on, was land that was not historically ours. And Paul, maybe you said, or Glenn, maybe you said at the beginning. When the folks at the Grand Ronde talk about their history, they talk about the fact, we've been here for 10,000 years, and we never really claimed ownership over this land, and so now for you to say, this little small patch is yours is such an alien concept for us. you know, and so when we do land acknowledgement, we're acknowledging there were peoples here before we were, you know. Paul?
The Leech Lake Gateway author that I'm reading makes a big point of the fact that, whites basically said an Indian is an Indian is an Indian.
Yeah.
Put them all in boarding schools.
Yeah.
The boarding school decades, they're still, eight that I know of. But those decades did more to ease the intertribal conflicts than anything, as those adolescents, married each other, different tribes in those boarding schools. So that, paradoxically, people are reclaiming this, I am this person,
Yeah.
through this grandmother, and this person, this
Yeah.
grandmother. But it was an unintended consequence.
Yeah, absolutely.
What's happened is that you can have relative peace in the Warm Springs with different peoples,
Absolutely.
but it's still, our hegemony, it's our kind of force.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So this brings us to, so the last thing I want to talk about today is just kind of a really quick brush through overview of how we got to where we're at today. Right? So I already talked about, this is the picture of things pre-European settlement. Keep in mind that, which is something I always have to remember, so through the 18th century, a lot is going on the other coast, so to speak. Believe it or not, echoes of those conflicts are felt out this direction. But prior to, we'll say, the 19th century, essentially, so after we get the establishment of the United States as a nation, we start getting states becoming part of the Union. I mean, so does anybody remember what year does Oregon become a state within the Union? 1856. 1856 is when we become a state. That was the second time that we voted to ratify our statehood. But so prior to the Americans, quote unquote, controlling this area, the British pretty much owned everything. Well, owned. The British had settlements and businesses that controlled everything down into Northern California, essentially, which is why British Columbia is called British Columbia, because originally British Columbia came all the way down to the Columbia, if that makes sense. Okay, and the company that controlled that fished and trapped in this area was the Hudson Bay Trading Company. And one of the interesting, well, I keep saying that, an interesting thing is that by and large, the native peoples had a relatively good relationship with the Hudson Bay Trading Company. Okay? It was after the War of 1812, when the British get kicked out of Oregon and Washington, that then U.S. interests take over up here. So again, this is 40 years before the statehood of Oregon. I don't remember when Washington becomes a state. But the American interests take over, and there was a stark shift in policy regarding the native peoples. The British essentially worked like the British do, which is if they could extract resources from the area, they would figure out the most efficient way to do that, which generally meant being on good relations with the peoples that were there. I mean, I'm not necessarily patting the British in the back here. I mean, it's still colonialism. It's still taking resources from lands that aren't yours. But by and large, they had a good relationship. The policy that was represented by many of those who came out, because, again, this was encouraged settlement, right? The Oregon Trail was an encouraged settlement. They were sending people out here to settle these barbarian wilds. The policy generally was there's no such thing as a good Indian, right? And any tribes that did exist between 1812 essentially all the way up through the establishment of the reservations, it was essentially a concerted effort to damage, diminish, make the Indians disappear. was really the push. Reason being, land, right? So while there were native peoples on the land, while there were native peoples fishing the waters, while there were native peoples that controlled areas, it made it difficult for white settlers to come in. And keep in mind, and one of the interesting things too is that The normal plot of land that people were getting, so settlers that were coming across, they were getting about a square mile of land. For any of you that have farmed before, do you know how many people it takes to farm a square mile? More than one family can do. So here's the ironic, tragic thing, is that as we're dispossessing these native peoples of their land, we're also rehiring them to work the land that we've taken from them. I mean, I don't want to come, I don't want to come across as too masochistic or sadistic here, but
One quick, in my travels to Finland and Norway, meeting relatives, it was amazing how many of the young people would inquire, why did you do that to your Native Americans?
yeah.
And it's interesting how the Finnish deal with the Sami.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was shocked.
Yeah.
They knew so much about our history.
Yeah, well, and even, believe it or not, European cultures have a fascination with United States, and especially the Wild West. There are French comics. What's the one about the Lucky Luke? Thank you. Yeah, that are about this, and a lot of it's tongue in cheek, kind of. That's a different topic. Okay, so 1850s is when, in Oregon at least, you get the establishment of the reservations, which were forced. In fact, when, at least with regards to the Grand Ronde, when that journey begins, they gave them 1 day. So U.S. militia came in, said, you packed up as much as you can carry, we're moving you to your reservation, it's happening tomorrow, and that was it, right? Which, doesn't take much to imagine what that trauma would have been like. And as we look at the history of the signing of these treaties that established the reservation, there was so much, number one, there was so much that was promised that never got followed through on. But number two, there was so much that was never communicated clearly. And if you look at the treaty document, they're all in the archive in the National Library, right? You can see a lot of these. It will have nice penmanship, the names of all the chiefs, and they all sign with an X, meaning that none of them speak the language of the document that they're signing in, okay? Which in and of itself is an issue. And so one of the things that you see looking forward is that you realize that many of the tribes that were signing these agreements did not understand either what they were signing or understanding the consequences of what that would mean for them and their people. And we were okay with that. We were very okay with that. Again, because the primary motivation for us was we just wanted these folks to disappear. They'd been conquered. They had been defeated. We wanted them to stop being pains in the butt. We wanted their land. We didn't want to have to deal with them anymore. And the reservations at that time were seen as the answer to that question. They can have that land. Okay, now let's fast forward 100 years. Okay. So what happens, as is wont to do, is that as more and more people move to Oregon and move to Washington, and land becomes more of a valuable resource, and we get logging, timber rights, we get fishing rights, we get all these things that we need land for, is that we started to covet the reservation land that had been allotted to these tribes, which I can show you the other map. Does anybody know about the termination? I mean, we refer to it as the Termination Act of 1856, I think it was. We'll spend a lot more time with this eventually because it's really fascinating to look at. But to make a long story very short, after some great federal and state conniving, we terminated the reservation agreement. And the justification was that the Indians didn't need it anymore. This was a great time for them to integrate into modern society, and the language that was used was for them to become full citizens of our country. Again, that really flies in the face of the fact that reservations are sovereign entities, right? So we essentially, in the snap decision, decided these folks are no longer sovereign entities. They're now full citizens, but with none of the benefits that come along with it. We didn't do anything really to help them integrate into society. Our argument essentially was we've been doing that for 100 years. They didn't take advantage of it. But the agreement is that we purchased their reservation lands off them. We purchased the property that they lived on. And the way that those costs were calculated was on a per tribal member basis. So they priced out the market cost of the totality of the land, and each member of the tribe got a portion of that when they moved off the reservation. But you know what we did? We expensed all the aid that we've given them for the past 100 years. So blankets, food, water, housing, whatever it was a red line in the total tally of how much money they got. So, for example, one of the tribes that's on the Grand Ronde Reservation got $35 per person for their tribal lands, right? And at one point they had over 60,000 acres of property, and now they have nothing, and they get $35. Congratulations, this is what you get to live on. Okay, Jim,
One
go.
more comment. As far as buying the land, the tribe, the idea of owning land,
Yeah,
the idea of, this was like the Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
Sharing for it. And the idea of selling or the treaty that talk about land transfer was like totally foreign
absolutely.
to their mindset.
And this was not the first, by no means was this the first attempt at it. So if you look at the history of the tribes in Washington, this was attempted and succeeded several times. So there was specifically a tribe, again, near the Puget Sound, where Union Pacific Railroad wanted to run a railroad through there, but they couldn't because it's reservation land. And so what they ended up doing through a series of conniving maneuvers is they convinced the specific tribe to agree to lease their land to the Union Pacific, but in order for them to lease their land, they had to nullify the treaty agreement, which made it a trust of the U.S., which made it then available for purchase after a certain amount of time. And so then the Union Pacific purchased land from many of these folks at pennies on the dollar. They didn't know what they were getting involved in, and by the time they knew any better, it was too late. And the city of Seattle and the state of Washington helped that happen, to be fair. Okay, so that's not the end of the story, though. So 1856 is, and it's got another name, which I'll remember at some point, but the Reservation Termination Act is not the title. It's actually a much longer, better sounding name. That's not the end of the story. So throughout the 70s and 80s, what you get is then the Restoration Movement. And kind of the root of this is realizing that what we did in the Termination Act was actually unconstitutional, and had a very good case, and which we'll talk about at length if you're interested in it. But then, so what we witness is through the 70s and 80s is the restoration of the lands, most of them that were taken from these people. Because keep in mind, when we purchased that land, what did we do with it? We sold it. We promptly sold it to private interests, to industry, to individuals, right? To lumber and timber interests. We made our buck after it. And the timing is not coincidental. It's right after World War II, right? Where we've got a booming economy and expansive growth and all those things that are going on. So, but then throughout the 70s and 80s, we get the restoration. So, without looking at my notes, I believe that the Grand Ronde restoration was passed in 1983 or 80. I think it was 83. It was 83. But if you do the math, that's over almost 30 years between which these people were dispossessed of their lands and simultaneously their language and their culture, right? Because they were dispersed. You could almost talk of it, as we do of the exile, And so now, fast forward again to the modern era, what you've got going on is a concerted effort, especially in the Pacific Northwest, by pretty much all the tribes of the Pacific Northwest to recover their heritage, their culture, and their language that was lost, not only during these 30 years that they had been dispossessed of their lands, but over these 300 years that they've been in decline. And the resources out there are absolutely fascinating. So I'm going to just show you a couple of them, then I'll let you go. I'm sorry, we got started late and I'm running late. Okay. This website is fantastic, okay? This is the Grand Ronde Confederated Tribes website. And like I said, this 3-minute video, which we're not going to show now, is a fantastic kind of intro. They have information, so pretty much everything that I've talked about today has come from these resources. Here's another more detailed, it's going to take forever to load. We'll wait for that to load. Termination, restoration, what I just talked about. Sorry, it was 1954 was when they lost their lands. That stuff is good. The stuff I've really been enjoying is this piece of it. So when I send out the weekly email this week, I'll include links to these things so you can take a peek at it. But they actually have, which I can't look at it because I'm streaming on YouTube, but they actually have they have several YouTube channels that have like I told you, the videos that were intended for their youth, and they're literally like kids shows that are, appropriately themed. But then they also have videos that are intended for adult audiences, and they're like quick 17-minute ones. The one video that if you have the time to watch, which again I'll send out that link, it's about an hour and 14 minutes long, is an interview with, I forgot the dude's name. Should have written it down. Basically, he's the leading historian of Native peoples in this region. And it's an interview with him, and he basically talks through kind of these same three phases that I talked about, but obviously in a really condensed manner. All right. Drinking from the fire hose, folks. I'm sorry, I threw a bunch of information at you today, but obviously you can tell how excited I am about it. So next week, we're going to talk about the Kalapuya. We're going to talk about what life looked like in that, in this region during that time. We're going to talk about Wapato. We're going to talk about grape root tea. We're going to talk about all these fun things. So, thank you. Blessed Sunday. No. Maybe eventually. I think that would be fun. That would be fun.